By the time the floorboards whispered under unfamiliar weight, the house had already betrayed me. The lavender candle we always saved for good days burned like a signal flare for someone else, while the framed wedding photo on the dresser reflected a silhouette that wasn't mine. I stood in the doorway with the quiet of a man trying to keep the world from shattering too loud, and measured the distance between what I thought love was and what it had become. Before the night ended, I would learn that betrayal doesn't arrive alone. It brings witnesses, contracts, and a history that pretends it isn't there. The house on Easton Terrace had thin walls and a patient view of the river. From the upstairs window, the water looked like a ribbon tucked beneath the neighborhood's careful lawns and trimmed hedges. When we moved in, I painted the front door a deep blue because my grandmother said blue kept the bad spirits from wandering in. She never warned me that some spirits were familiar faces. My wife chose the lavender candle, the soft throw blanket, the plant that never grew and yet refused to die. We wanted a home that felt like a promise we could step into every evening. I worked as a community planner at the city office, a job that put numbers and history in the same room and asked them to get along. I drew maps where the borders had been drawn by other, quieter decisions: loans denied, parks placed far away, bus routes curving like a shrug. I believed that if I stood long enough over blueprints and zoning codes, I could push the needle towards something gentler. My wife taught art at a magnet school across town. She painted after dinner, shoulders lined with colors that clung to her like constellations. We had routines: Saturday morning coffee, Sunday river walks, Thursday pasta that somehow tasted like the first time we fell in love. That first year, the neighborhood learned our faces, then studied them. It watched us carry groceries and laughed without laughing when the gate's keypad sputtered for me until a neighbor happened to stroll by and the metal decided it knew my code after all. Letters from the Homeowners Association came like weather. Once for the grass that grew a half-inch too free, once for leaving a cardboard box at the curb overnight, once for the music I played too softly to be heard through closed windows. The letters arrived on white paper that pretended to be polite. I kept them in a folder because I knew where these patterns led, because my grandmother kept folders too. That summer, a man I'd seen at HOA meetings began to wave like we were friends. He smiled with the kindness of someone holding a measuring tape. He ran a security company that had recently convinced the board to install cameras around the neighborhood. He spoke often about safety, about keeping the community intact, about statistics that didn't live here but liked to visit. When I jogged at dusk, a cruiser sometimes drifted by, curious about my face in my own streets. The officer always said it was routine. Routine is what people call a bruise when they don't want to ask how it got there. Inside our house, we told ourselves we were building something protected from those small exhaustions. We chose slow dinners, quiet movies, conversations that drifted from what we had to what we could still become. I thought we were navigating the outside weather together, two hands under the same umbrella. I noticed my wife sleeping later, the way her phone glowed in other rooms, new perfume that lingered like a question. I noticed, and then I taught myself not to notice, as if love were a stray cat I could coax back to the porch just by refusing to admit it had wandered. The night it happened, the river was loud and the sky looked like a bruise healing. I let myself in with grocery bags and the kind of relief that comes with believing home will catch you. The lavender candle was already burning. The human heart is a room with doors you forgot were there. That's what I thought as I stood in the hallway and watched my wife move through our bedroom with a carefulness I recognized from her painting. She smoothed the duvet, arranged pillows as if symmetry could keep something sacred, and placed her phone face down on the nightstand. There are betrayals that scream, and betrayals that introduce themselves as policies. We had been living with the latter for months. During a heavy rainfall, I stood under the carport while two officers asked about a break-in 3 streets over. I matched their calm, explained my route home, gestured toward the camera overhead that I had voted against. They nodded, took notes like they were petting a dog they didn't intend to adopt, and left with the reassurance that comes easily to people who haven't had to memorize tone and posture like survival skills. The next day, a letter appeared reminding all residents to be vigilant. The ink did not say my name, but it understood my address. My wife said the neighborhood just needed time, that people act like this until they don't. She said it while rinsing paintbrushes, water stained with color that spun down the drain. She began to stay late at school. Budget cuts, she explained. Parent meetings, grant applications, the noble grind of a teacher who kept shelves of dried clay animals to remind herself what hands could do when they felt seen. Weeks edged by, and with them, small absences. The plant that never grew finally leaned toward surrender. The lavender candle dwindled to a wax ring. The blue door needed new paint. One afternoon, my wife came home with a tightness around her smile, a carefulness that made the air feel like glass. She asked about my day the way a stranger asks how to find the freeway. I told her about bus routes, about a new proposal for a park where the city had long placed storage lots. She nodded, and I wanted to ask where she had gone while sitting right there. The man from the HOA waved at me again a week later, his truck idling. He praised the neighborhood's order, the cameras he had advocated for, the sense of calm they inspired. He spoke warmly about community, how it thrived when everyone did their part. Behind his words, something stood rigid. I thought of the letters, the patrol car's pause, the way the gate sometimes forgot me. I thought of how power can be disguised as courtesy and how courtesy can be weaponized as policy. The night of the lavender candle, I heard a voice in the foyer and footsteps that did not try to hide. I walked to the bedroom doorway and saw 3 toothbrushes in the cup by the sink. That tiny inventory undid me more than anything else. The house had adjusted without being asked. My wife met my eyes with a practiced steadiness that made me feel like a student being ushered through a lesson I had missed. A man stood behind her, the clean edges of his haircut tight against the script of his smile. My ribs felt like a filing cabinet being slammed shut. I thought of maps and lines, of permissions given without my consent, of how betrayal wears the tone of administration when it wants to be respected. Some moments arrive with such clarity that even breathing feels like trespassing. This was one of them. Betrayal has a texture. It's the way the bed sheet folded over itself like a wave that had forgotten how to return to shore. It's the single sock at the foot of the mattress that did not belong to me, patient and unashamed. It's the lavender candle burning past its own good sense. I learned, in that instant, that there are corridors in love where the lights never quite reach. Everything slowed, then sharpened. The room bloomed with details that would not stop arriving, the faint whir of the ceiling fan, the scratch on the dresser from the day we assembled it together, a tiny paint fleck near the headboard we once laughed about, promising to touch up on a morning that never came. It felt as if someone had tilted the entire house and I was sliding through it, catching on memories that had become furniture. I stepped farther into the bedroom and felt the rug's familiar roughness underfoot. In the mirror, my body looked like a fact rehearsing how to remain true. I took in the geometry, 3 toothbrushes, 2 water glasses, 1 wedding photo. The math was unambiguous. There is no script for how to hold your own chest together when the person who watched you grow gentler decides to rearrange the furniture of your life and calls it renovation. There is only breath and the steady drum of your heart insisting on its own continuity. I remembered the night a neighbor called the non-emergency line because I had stood under my porch light too long after a late shift. I remembered explaining, again, that I lived here. The officer's hand hovered near his hip, and the porch light drew insects to its orbit as if the truth could be a lighthouse. My wife had held my wrist after, tracing a circle with her thumb where my pulse pressed. The memory faltered under the new weight. The man from the HOA, because of course it was him, now that the story wanted to complete its rim, had stepped fully into the room. He radiated the civility of a meeting agenda, bullet points tucked into clean margins. The camera at the corner of the block, the letters with their absolute politeness, the way the gate code responded to some hands quicker than others, suddenly all of it felt connected, not as conspiracy, but as habit wearing a tie. He did not need to say anything for the narrative to become cruelly tidy, power courted by intimacy, surveillance resting its head on my pillow. My vision narrowed to a keyhole. In that keyhole, a river kept moving, stubborn and indifferent. I felt myself choosing. Not whether to forgive, not whether to rage, but whether to remain a version of myself that would always be managed, explained, tolerated. Betrayal, I realized, demands an answer, but it does not get to choose which one. The house held its breath. The lavender candle guttered, then steadied. I thought of my grandmother's blue doors, all the thresholds they had guarded against things that didn't need keys to enter. I thought of the folders I kept, history collecting itself into proof. I thought of a map I had been drafting for months, lines unspooling from an idea no one wanted to believe in until it existed under their feet. I exhaled, and the future shifted, not into something kinder yet, but into something I could build without permission. I slept on the couch that night, not out of penance, not because the bed had become haunted, but because the living room still knew my body by heart. The river moved like a long thought. Morning walked in without knocking. I stood under a shower that felt both punishing and clean, dressed in the kind of clothes people wear when they plan to handle paperwork. I made coffee that tasted like courage and bitterness in equal measure, and chose not to perform dignity for anyone else's comfort. The bed upstairs belonged to a story I hadn't consented to. The rest of the house still held room for my next chapter. At the city office, I opened the folder where the letters from the HOA lived beside printouts of data sets that had made me tired for months. Complaints mapped to certain blocks. Patrol routes that hovered near particular houses. Committee votes that kept amenities just far enough from families whose kids needed places to run. Emails where politeness grew teeth. I thought of how betrayal often mimics the cadence of systems that want you to believe your pain is a misunderstanding. Then I started writing. The proposal was not a rant. It was a blueprint that carried the steadiness of steel beams. Its spine was a residence bill of rights for neighborhoods under the umbrella of city-approved associations. Clear appeals processes. Transparent enforcement thresholds. An ombudsperson unaffiliated with the HOA to mediate conflicts. Mandatory anti-bias training for board members and contracted security companies. Regular audits of whose complaints became policy, and whose concerns became silence. Installation of community cameras governed by consent and independent oversight, or no cameras at all. Enforcement mechanisms that meant something more than a scolding letter and less than a cruiser at dusk. A set of lines to keep the weather honest. I submitted it to my department director with the professionalism of a person who knew the power of timbre. Then I emailed a copy to a local reporter who had been writing about the slow, daily ways inequity maintains itself. Not as a leak, but as an invitation. If the neighborhood wanted to discuss safety, let the city learn to spell it right. At home, I packed a week's worth of clothes and left a note on the kitchen counter that avoided the theater of final words. There would be conversations and legalities, rooms with chairs that felt too straight, signatures that promised endings and beginnings in the same line. But I would not be making announcements from the doorway of my own pain. I rented a small place near the river's bend, where the water widened as if deciding to forgive itself. The apartment was stubbornly plain. I painted the door blue, not out of superstition but habit. I put the lavender candle on the windowsill and did not light it. Some things look different when you stop using them for what they were never meant to do. Days turned into a clear routine. Work. Running at dusk without shrinking past patrol cars. Calls to my sister that reminded me survival can sound like laughter. Therapy on Tuesdays in a room where the chair finally fit. I learned to describe the betrayal without protecting it, to understand that infidelity is not just a derailing of intimacy but a referendum on truth. I had stepped into a story where the person who promised to witness the weather with me had invited a storm inside and asked me to admire the lightning. Months later, the policy I wrote woke up the city's bloodstream. The reporter's piece made its way across feeds and inboxes. Board members I had never met suddenly considered the shape of their influence. Some scoffed in the familiar way of people who believe fairness is an indictment. Others softened into questions. At a public forum, residents stood to tell their versions of the same ache, the letter that arrived too quick, the note that did not address them by name, the patrol car's slow, appraising drift. The room passed microphones like they were heavy stones that became lighter with each hand. The city adopted the framework, first as a pilot in our district, then as standard. A year after the lavender candle burned past its own wick, I was asked to lead the office that would hold neighborhoods accountable to the better story we now required. I accepted, not as absolution, but as craft. Maps are not miraculous, they are choices. So are marriages. So are communities that learn to be brave in public. My wife reached out once, then again, with messages whose sentences felt like someone sweeping glass with their hands. I met her at a cafe with sunlight that didn't apologize. We spoke like two citizens of a country they had tried to build together, with laws that had not held. She said she had mistaken bravery for novelty, tenderness for boredom, safety for stagnation. She said she had wanted a life that felt like a painting still wet. I said I had wanted a home where we both told the truth before it fractured into policy. We parted with the kind of grace that doesn't undo the past, only stops it from recruiting the future. On a Sunday morning, I ran along the river until my breath found a rhythm that sounded like me. Families set out blankets. Teenagers on skateboards stitched laughter into the air. An older couple shared a bench like a secret. The water moved the way time does when it remembers to be kind. I thought of my grandmother's blue doors, of all the thresholds I had crossed, and the ones I had built myself. Betrayal had not ended me. It had ended a chapter that needed to end so the next pages could stand up straight. If there is a lesson in this, it is not about punishment or spectacle. It is about boundaries that refuse to masquerade as bitterness, about systems that can be taught to tell the truth, about a heart that learns its own geometry. Love is not a camera perched on a corner, recording what it has decided to see. Love is the audit, the appeal, the shared understanding that safety is never an excuse for control. Community, marriage, self-respect, each is a map. Draw them with lines that hold. Some nights, I still pass the old house and notice the door has been repainted a neutral shade that blends with the block. I do not slow down. I am moving toward a life that does not require me to shrink so it can be convenient. The river, companion as steady as breath, keeps me honest. And you, where have you let someone else write your policies, and what would change if you drafted your own?